together officially. Next week is just a test day on Tuesday, and you submit everything in terms of your take-home exam. So remember, the take-home exam is posted, and then I modify it on Thursday, and it includes like part 2, which is the second part, and it'll give you the opportunity to have the entire exam as a take-home, and that's got to be between you and me, because I've never done that in my life. But you know, I got to do what I got to do. And thanks for being flexible with that. So it should be an opportunity, I would think, for you to do really, really well. So today we are going to continue kind of pursuing the world of synapses, and we're going to talk a little bit about what it takes to get a neuron to communicate and to maybe trigger a memory. So we're going to start talking a little bit about how we are able to achieve memory, what's the difference between immediate and short-term and long-term memory, and then we're going to end with something that's not so fun to talk about, and that is the world of dementia and how some of us will experience it some way with a family member, hopefully not you, where you have the loss of memory. And when it starts to apply to your immediate memory, let's see what is in this book. Okay, then it becomes really kind of disturbing and sad and horrible. So my grandfather died with Alzheimer's, and I'll talk a little bit about that and what my memories were of that. But that's what we'll end with. We'll end with a really upper. You know, let's talk about Alzheimer's. Yes.
Last Thursday, we
Mm.
kind of stopped mid lecture 17. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we still
I don't
had to go
remember that.
over. Are you?
I don't
This
remember
sounds
that.
like looks like the beginning of 18. So I just
Yeah.
wonder if
I
that's
can't remember. We didn't finish 17?
I don't think so.
no.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's narrow down with hyperpolarization.
Got to hyperpolarization
check
and then
real quick.
stopped.
Okay, well, thanks, Cheryl.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know if you wanted to go over it
Yeah, well, let me look.
in class. Although, it looks like lecture 18 is largely the second half of 17.
Okay.
If you look at it, yeah.
We finished with.
So never mind, I guess,
We
'cause-
finished here,
Yeah,
Started.
Yeah.
so we're good.
Yeah.
yeah, so I guess
So this is just
the
a
second half
continuation.
of what's in here
I
is
see what you're-
18.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's actually 18.
it's the exact same thing.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, never mind, Mike,
Sorry
sorry.
for the confusing. Okay, so today we're gonna talk a little bit about the whole process of incorporating information at the trigger zone so that we can develop a memory. And the way that we do that, of course, is by incorporating synapses. And synapses were our big topic last time, and we talked about neurotransmitters. We kind of went off on a tangent a little bit and talked about mental illness and street drugs. And one of the questions that I'll probably ask you on the final exam, the second part, is probably to explain a little bit about how Narcan works. And so I could give you the answer, but I will want you to kind of figure that out. It has everything to do with the neurotransmitter and the receptor, and there's some type of, we'll just say some type of competition at that cleft, and that's usually how Narcan is able to work very successfully. So when we think of a synapse, we think of communication, and we think of neurotransmitters. And we talked about the fact that when we have communication, that signal is generally sent down the axon if the trigger zone reaches threshold. So threshold was something that we said was this imaginary dotted line, and if a cell reached threshold, which meant a certain number of positivity or in excitatory neurotransmitters, it would open up the floodgates and allow sodium to rush in and create a spark that would travel down an axon that was well insulated. So our job today is to talk about how does the trigger zone really make that decision. We described it as a democracy. But now you can see that we call those local potentials something very specific. We can call those local potentials, remember the ones that accumulate at the trigger zone, we can call them excitatory and we can call them inhibitory. So we're gonna now say that local potentials have a special name, that if they're excitatory, we call them EPSPs, excitatory postsynaptic potentials. And it's these that accumulate and start raising the positivity, the charge at the trigger zone to see if it reaches threshold. But you can see that we also have inhibitory postsynaptic potentials. So it's a battle, kind of, it's kind of like I said, democracy, majority wins. We talked about some examples of excitatory and some examples of some negative or inhibitory types of neurotransmitters. And these are all accumulating, and our brain is making decisions constantly based on what accumulates at the trigger zone. So if we have a lot of positivity and we're excitatory and not too many inhibitory, then we start getting a bump. Look at that. So one bump doesn't get us to threshold. So that's nothing. That's gonna be something that your brain says, I'm not responding. Or look at this, one dip, one inhibitory postsynaptic potential, that's definitely not gonna reach threshold. That's gonna dip below, look, resting membrane potential. And inhibitory is going to potentially cause hyperpolarization, which we said was really what GABA does when you drink alcohol. Slows everything down, makes it harder to reach threshold. So in order to get an excitatory response, we need majority wins. And it's a battle, and that's why it's not something where you get a complete kind of response that looks exactly like a straight line. Sometimes you have a little bit of up, followed by a little bit of down. But the ultimate goal is to reach threshold. Now, the brain sends signals to whatever effector, remember glands or muscles, in a number of different ways. And you can see in some cases, the pre and the post are really just about one specific, we'll say, stimulus. This could be like, wow, that was really hot. Move your finger. Or you could say, wow, I'm experiencing a lot of different stimuli that are telling me to do something. So if it's coming from one source, we call it temporal summation. If it's coming from a number of different sources at the same time that ultimately result in us reaching threshold, we call it spatial summation. It doesn't matter, because again, it all comes down to the trigger zone. What happens at the trigger zone? Does majority win? Not all of these lines or signals, or what we'll call local potentials, are excitatory. Some are inhibitory. So it says when it accumulates at that point where the axon kind of fuses with the cell body, is there enough to reach threshold? If there is, then we send a signal. And the signal moves down this axon and releases neurotransmitters and communicates to the next cell or the effector or whatever it is lying. So when you look at this graph, this is the one that's been modified. This is more up to date. I told you, I think, what was it, 2 lectures ago, to take a picture of a graph that looks like this. But now you can see, instead of just this diagonal line that we talked about last time, it's all about stimuli. And you can see it's not a straight shot, because we have some that maybe tell us, hey, it's inhibitory. Oh, it's excited, it's inhibitory. It's excitatory, it's inhibitory. And so ultimately, excitatory wins, because once it reaches threshold, then the floodgates open and creates that spike, creates the signal. So now you know that when you are responding to things, whether it's things that you're aware of or whether things that you're completely unconscious about, it's a battle at the trigger zone. And your brain can learn to adapt to some of those responses. And some of those change throughout our lives. Yeah, Dave.
Is there an example of the spatial as compared to temporal?
Yeah, so spatial would be like maybe getting a number of different senses that you're in danger. You see it, you hear it, you smell it. This is, oh, this is just coming from one sense. That would be an example. I understand that. So let's talk about this idea of what happens when the nerve signal is sent. We know that in most cases, we said that the synapse releases neurotransmitters, and we send a signal. In this case, the signal is excitatory. And if there's receptors, then boom, we have a response. But occasionally, we have what we call axo-axonic inhibition, where we have a block. Somehow, it prevents, look at this, the calcium channels to open. Oh, that's clever. That's clever. There's a neurotransmitter that blocks or prevents calcium from entering. So there's no signal that's left. So many cases of pain management, natural pain management, is done through this kind of mechanism. Did you know our body produces natural opiates at some point, sometimes in our life? Maybe that's how you explain women who can give birth without an epidural. Maybe this is how you can explain people who have maybe a gunshot wound to some area of their body and yet they can keep fighting, you know? Yeah.
Does that still count for things like shock for like extreme injuries like losing a limb? Where
Yeah,
say you go,
yeah,
like,
yeah, that definitely, that applies. Yeah, it's the same idea, yeah.
What are those neurotransmitters called?
Those are not neurotransmitters, they're opiates.
So
So there's different types of opiates that your body releases. Yeah, they're similar to the opiates you can buy on the street.
they're not.
They are?
So well, no, sorry, I wasn't correct. I wasn't contradicting you. Like, so if I break my arm, I've heard people say I broke my arm, but I didn't feel anything.
Yeah, or you hear about like you watch Shark Week, you hear
You don't feel it.
The surfboard guy say, my leg got bit off and I didn't feel it.
That's not a rush of that's not a rush of endorphins.
Endorphins as well as natural opiates.
Okay, but those are different.
Yes, 100%, yeah. So the endorphins get you to fight or get to safety, but the opiates are the one that block the pain.
Is endorphins? Is that a neurotransmitter or a chemical?
Yeah, so endorphins can be considered kind of both hormone and neurotransmitter. Yeah, so like adrenaline, like norepinephrine, that can go both ways. Yep. Okay, so let's now get into the whole process of taking the information from the synapse and trying to make sense of it. And of course, people have written books and books and lectures on the whole idea of creating a memory. So we're not going to go into that kind of detail, but I think we'll be able to understand a little bit. And it all goes back to our knowledge of the neuromuscular junction, believe it or not, or a cholinergic response, where we have calcium playing a role. Remember, calcium plays a role in allowing the neurotransmitter to be released by exocytosis. So one of the things that we see is that when we try to do something on a repetitive basis, sometimes what we're really doing is we're causing the neurotransmitter to linger longer in the synaptic cleft. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's probably having to do with releasing more calcium into the knob, which all of you, I think, would probably say, yeah, that makes sense. So what we're going to be looking at is some of the molecular explanation of what causes a memory to stay, maybe for a minute, or for a week, or maybe for a lifetime. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so we have qualitative and quantitative types of information. So when we talk about quality, we're talking about whether it's really salty or really sweet or really bright or really painful. And then quantity tells us the thresholds, whether it's, where is it coming from? And it's talking about the location more than the quality. So we're going to be looking at both qualitative and quantitative information and how that makes a memory. And one of the first things that we have to kind of understand is that it takes more than one synapse to get the job done. I always look at this kind of diagram and think of it as like a board of directors. You can see there's one input neuron, and then there's several neurons that are playing a role. And if this information is really important, then what the information will tend to do is it'll be sent to a number of different locations. And the more synapses, as we talked about, the more likely that you're going to create more synapses and maybe get the job done. But you can see that a response, in most cases, requires a team response. And you have a discharge zone, and what distinguishes the discharge zone from a helper or facilitated zone is just the number of synapses. So you have the input, and you can see that it's synapsing several times with these neurons. So it means that this group is really important. These are also somewhat important, but kind of the further away you go from the input, the less kind of, I guess, role that you play in getting the response taken care of. So when we think of an input neuron, let's talk about part of the brain called the medulla. The medulla is involved with a lot of vital functioning, like breathing and heart rate. So if this neuron was in the medulla, then it's going to send signals to a lot of places that are involved with breathing, right? But probably most of the discharge would be going to a place called your diaphragm. So the diaphragm is like the main mover, or let's use some muscle talk, it's the primary mover of breathing. But there's some other muscles involved, like your rib muscles. There's even muscles in your neck that are involved with breathing, believe it or not. So these are all facilitated helpers, but when we look at the discharge zone, these are the ones where it's going to think of it in muscular terms, the primary mover. So it's not just muscles, right? It can go to other neurons, it can go to other places, but it's a team effect. So when we think of this pathway that uses this team effect, we have to use a word called circuit. And anytime I hear the word circuit, I think of like electrical problems in my house. Like, oh, the circuit breaker. Oh, there's a bad circuit. This outlet doesn't work. Yeah. So think of circuits as an electrical pathway, And that's really what a synapse is, right? It's taking an electrical information, an action potential from one neuron to another. And what we can see is that there's a number of different types of circuits. Now I can sit up here and just read it. That would be boring. So what I want to do is show you some examples, and then come back and we'll read it, and it'll make sense, I think. So let's take a look at some of these different types of these circuits, or these teamwork pathways. And one of them that's very, very common is a circuit that involves, just like we talked about, one input neuron having an effect on a number of different locations. So this could be like the brain, if you want to think of it in very general terms, sending out information to thousands of different places in your body. Or it could be converging, right? This could be something like the back of your eye, which we're going to talk about today in lab, the retina. It's getting a ton of different types of stimuli. Some are bright, some are dim colors, some are red, some are green, some are blue. All of that information is being funneled into one nerve that goes to the brain. So whether it's one source diverting to many, or many sources of information going into one, you can almost think of this also as kind of like motor versus sensory. Like this is information going towards the brain, and this is information going away from the brain, diverging. This one down here we could talk about for a long time, and I love talking about reverberating circuits. Let's look at this. It says that this is a one-path circuit, and before we get to the end of the road, it says, let's do that again. And I think that what I've learned, and maybe you've picked up on this, the way I teach, and this is not something I did in the first 10 years of teaching. This is something that required, experience for me. And that is, I try to reverberate your circuits all the time. while I'm teaching. I will talk about things from the past. I will talk about things that we talked about in the first week. I will talk about things that we're gonna talk about in the future. I keep kind of reverberating those circuits. You know, I just did it a couple minutes ago, talking about a primary mover. So you might say, whoa, I do remember that. The biceps and the brachialis are synergist and primary. Remember that diagram that was on the test? So when we think of reverberating, it applies to me as a teacher. You know, I try to make sure that I reverberate your circuits so that you can remember things. But then I always get students, and not so much with this class has been one of the best classes I've ever had, but in the fall, I'm gonna get some freshman students at Xavier that are gonna be, 18? I'm gonna get some freshman students at Cincinnati State. And I would say, 40% of them have no idea how to study. Let's be honest, they don't know how to study. So they'll do horrible on the first test. And then they'll come to me and say, Mike, can you tell me how to study? You know? So I tell them, you have to, and I don't use the word reverberating, but you have to figure out a way that gets the information in. For some of you, that's just like rewriting, retyping your notes several times. Some of you make flashcards. Oh, what a great example of a reverberating circuit. I'm gonna go through my stack of flashcards. Some of you draw things, you know? So everybody learns different. Everybody has to reverberate their circuits in a different way. And that's the hard thing, because I can't just say, everybody make flashcards, because it doesn't work like that for everybody. Sometimes back in the glory days of kindergarten, we were taught the ABCs by singing, you know, incorporating music, and a lot of times that helps. Most of you could go to a bar and do karaoke and remember the words, you know, of Bon Jovi or whatever. You know, when a certain song comes on, you know the words because you've sang it. So some people say, let's make this a song. Or think of like the multiplication facts. If I say, what's 3 times 2? I mean, you say 6 before you even think about it, right? So reverberating can be verbal, it can be visual, but I also want you to write down that reverberating can be procedural. So if I say tie your shoes, do you have to think about it? No. If I say go from your house to your school, your elementary school that you lived in, you know, even if you don't live there anymore, you can tell me exactly, probably, how many stop signs, how many stop lights, right? I mean, you're looking up right now, and you're reverberating your circuits. Yeah, Michael?
Is that the whole concept of muscle memory?
Well, kinda, yeah. So like sometimes you'll be driving someplace and you say, whoa, I didn't mean to go
Well, I
there.
mean, like in sports stuff. too.
Oh, yeah, sports, yeah, muscle memory, definitely. That's a great example. Yeah, so procedural, yes, exactly. That's another great example. I've never used that, but yeah, that's a great example. So when I think of reverberating circuits, it's something that is lost when people start approaching that dreaded word dementia. And even though you might say, you go to a party and you say, hey, there's like 4 people I want you to meet, you know, how many of those people do you remember? Now at your age, you probably remember all 4 of them.
0.
But you notice me, in the first day of lab, my strategy for reverberating my circuit was to say, okay, Mary, you know, Mary says she likes to be called Mary Mary. And then all of a sudden I said, Mary, tell me something about you. And she says, I like to smell armpits. And I say, time out. I'm good. I will never forget that, you know? I mean, that right there is enough for me to remember Mary Mary. Now listen, probably for a year. That's pathetic, you know? Here Anwar came in. You remember Anwar came in? He stood in the back of the room last class and he walked up and I gave him a hug. He was and is one of my favorite people. But for a split second there, I panicked, like, oh my gosh, what's his name? You know? No, it's sad. Because when I was 25, man, I would have remembered it. When I was 25, guess what? I'll share some personal information. When I was 25, I went to every Xavier graduation. Because I could say, I remembered all my students' names. I know all of your names. I had, 200 students at Xavier? I remembered them all. And so at graduation, I would say, oh, hey Amanda, congratulations, let's get a picture, you know? But then, once I started getting in my late 30s, it was like I did that thing like, oh, hi, it's great to see you. Yeah, it's like, I know Amanda, but I can't remember her name.
Don't you feel like a lot of that is people being in their right context though? Like you would remember his name if it was a class, like,
No.
well, actually you said it was the same classroom, so
It was the
maybe not.
exact same classroom.
Because I, like, if I meet people when I'm bartending and then I see them out, I'm like,
Yeah, you can't say, I know you from somewhere.
you,
Yeah,
you
now if he was
did.
in a bar,
You
then maybe you would
did.
know. Now, for me, it's not like that, because I will see people like on campus, you know, a year later, and I can't remember their names, you know, it's age. And so I have to do a lot of strategy as I've gotten older. I start thinking about, hey, tell me where you're from, what do you like to do, tell me something unusual about yourself. You know, when I was, 20 and young, I still played golf at that point, and I haven't played golf in like 20 years. Who has time to play golf? Anyway, I can remember going home and saying, I can visualize every shot that I took on the whole 18. I could remember where my ball was. I mean, it's just like that kind of memory, you know? So I'm saying to you now, enjoy it. And if you're starting to struggle, don't say and give up, because that's what a lot of older people do. They start chalking things up and saying, oh, I'm just old. Now you gotta figure out ways to strategize to beat the age issue. I mean, I'm doing it, right? I'm 51 and I'm trying, and I know all of your names. And I could probably tell you something about each one of you. Yeah, Ben?
I am a culprit of that, and
Oh, yeah?
I struggle with that.
How old are you,
I'm
Ben?
33,
Okay.
but I don't know if it's because I did teach for 5 years, and when I was teaching, I had a new group of students every 3 months, and it was
Yeah,
around
that's-
15 to 30, and I had to remember their names.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to do hair, so like getting new clients and stuff, but I find that it takes me like 3 to 5 minutes if I don't remember them, and then all of a sudden, it's like a light bulb goes off and I'll remember their name.
Oh.
And I don't know,
Huh.
and I find that happens to me with a lot of things if I don't remember, and
Okay.
it's the
Kind of like-
weirdest thing because it's almost within that 3 to 5 minute range. It's like I'm racking my brain, but it's like I'm trying
Yeah.
to like pull pieces together.
Maybe you're reverberating.
And literally, like out of nowhere, we'll be in a new conversation, and I'll
You'll
say
say, oh, I
someone's
know it,
name,
yeah.
and I feel so bad because
Yeah.
earlier, like I did it with my friend Kelly's husband this past Saturday. I saw her, and
Yeah.
I was like, Kelly, and then
Her
I went to go
husband's
introduce
hair.
her husband. I used to cut his hair.
Yeah.
And I was like, this is, and then I was like
Yeah.
waiting, and then he was like, Andrew, and I'm like, Andrew, yeah, and then like it was like a flood of memories came back
Yes,
to me
yes.
of what.
And Ben, I'm totally with you.
Okay, but I just didn't know if that was like
That's completely
normal or.
It's completely normal. But what I'm saying is that you at your age are gonna learn strategies to allow that memory to stay longer, if it's important to you. You know, when you think of marketing, David, I'll get you in a second. When you talk about marketing strategies, you'll notice that, like for example, my kids, when they want pizza, they don't even know what this means, but when they were younger, they would just say, Dad, will you call 347-1111? They'll just, because they know the song, you know, and you know, it was a clever little tune, and they said, just call that, Dad, come on. David, what's up?
I have a situation with memory too. It's somewhat closer to Ben's. I'm 30, and in high school, I could remember everyone's name, everyone's backstory, all their secrets, yada yada yada. And about 2 years after high school, I don't know, something happened, and unless you make a decent impression on me, I will forget your name. I'll forget everything about you.
Really?
Yes,
Huh.
I was wondering if maybe it's a change in my sight, like I just don't care anymore, or if there's something.
Well, yeah, you know, yeah,
I
that's a
think you're
great.
surrounded by those people all the time when you're in school, and then maybe
Yeah,
when you're not.
I think that part of it is trying to determine what is meaningful,
Yeah.
you know, and what is kind of extra. And maybe sometimes, you know, if you're not really into that conversation or that person.
Oh yeah,
you're not-
I totally shut them down.
Yeah,
Like it's
totally
like
shut
I'm
them down.
looking, but I'm not.
I kind of get that sometimes when I'm teaching, David. I'll look back there and he's giving me that look. You know what I'm talking about. Not you, Tasha. You always do good content. Jocelyn?
What about like mental illnesses and stuff, like depression and ADHD, like I have issues remembering, like
Yeah.
my fiance's always like, you're so scatterbrained in the morning.
Yeah,
Cause like
exactly.
I'll forget everything,
Yeah.
and I don't know why.
Yeah, so ADHD means that it's going to the finish line without reverberating.
Okay,
So you can't stay focused.
okay,
You need to slow down this pathway. So ADHD and ADD are just people who, their signals are flying. They may reverberate, but they're flying so fast that it doesn't have time
Doesn't
to make,
stay.
here's the key, a chemical change.
mhm,
So the longer that we have calcium lingering, is that the longer that there's a chance of it to stay in.
yeah,
Now, let me talk about this parallel after discharge, and there's not many examples of this. But you can see in this case, we have an input and one races, like ADD, ADHD. One goes slow and one goes really slow. So you get an input, and then what happens is that it lingers for a while. And the only really good example that I can give you of this is something called after imaging with your eyes, where you are maybe unexpectedly given or having someone take a picture of you with a flash. You said, whoa, I wasn't expecting that flash. I can still see it. The flash is still, I'm still seeing it. It's like wham, slow, right? So that's an example, and maybe you could use that with other senses. Yeah.
Would that include something like shell shock? I mean, not, there's other things involved, obviously, but,
Like, what do you mean? Give me an example.
so with shell shock, there's the concussion, but there's also the visual and the auditory,
Yeah,
aspects
so
of it.
lingering side effects, that would
Yeah.
be, that would be an example. Yeah, Joel.
So in art history, they use after imaging to teach you about color.
Oh,
Because
interesting.
artists often use, because I don't know if you know about the color wheel and how
Yeah.
certain colors are all opposite each other on the
Right.
color wheel. So artists will use a different color, the opposite color behind a color to boost the color that shows to your naked eye. But to teach that and to
You
learn
stare at it.
that you stare at like a red dot for 30
Uh-huh.
seconds and then you close your eyes and you get a green dot on the backs of your eyelids. So is that what's happening with parallel after discharge? Is that the same thing? Because you
100%.
talked about a flash and it
Yeah.
happening really quickly.
Yeah, but you can oversaturate, and it takes a
Okay.
long time for it.
Okay.
In
okay.
fact, there is, so, there's things that we do in lab, unfortunately, we don't do them at Cincinnati State, where you can take a colored square from any color
Mhm.
of construction paper, if you remember what that is, and put it right in the middle of a white piece of paper, like blue, and you stare at it on white for like a minute, remove the blue, and all of a sudden you look back on white, you see green.
You see green.
And I had no idea that artists intentionally did that.
They do.
Why do they do that? So that you get a different perception?
Because your eye actually, your eye perceives it. Your eye perceives the color, the opposite colors on the color wheel when you look at a color. So if I was looking at that blue wall, your eye will also perceive the red behind it, the
Okay.
opposite color on the color wheel.
So when you go to an art museum, is it like technique to stare at it for a while?
No, it's not like that. It's as you're looking at the painting,
Uh-huh.
the artist has already put the colors behind there. So if
It's like
an
a
artist wants
subconscious,
a red, like
subconscious
a red
right?
thing, they'll lay down green underneath it before they put the red, and that boosts the color naturally for your eye.
Boy, that's
Because your eye is
pretty deep.
already perceiving it. Not every artist does it,
Huh.
but it was definitely discovered in the Renaissance, and they
Wow,
have done it,
It's fascinating.
no, that's
Very
pretty cool.
cool. Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
And I learned
See,
about it a little bit in
I'm gonna use muscle
psychology,
memory,
but then
and I'm gonna use this
I never
example.
knew this with the
Yeah,
parallel after
Joe, I love
discharge.
that.
That's really interesting.
I love that.
Is this just like the processing part? Like,
The
Is
processing.
this just the sensation?
No,
Or-
this is processing.
Well, if it's parallel like that, is that something like if you did, like, have like a taste aversion too? Where it's lingering like that to cause like a remaining effect on your memory? Or is that a different process?
So this is all about memory. So experiencing some type of stimulus is different.
Okay.
So you could say, well, what about like a deep pain versus a sharp pain that comes and goes? This is all about forming a memory. So that's a little different, but kind of in the same ballpark. So let's go back and talk about what the previous slide said, now that we have a visual of what they are. It says a diverging versus converging, so we know what that means. Diverging means to divert to many sources, converging means to funnel into one. Reverberating, you can see that it's starting to mention some things associated with cell-to-cell kind of communication. And then the parallel one is, again, the one that we ended with, where it says that the firing rates tend to differ. There's a burst followed by a lingering one. Now, when we talk about these circuits, and I think reverberating is the one that's most applicable, I think, to learning, especially when you're trying to learn something new, we have to get into the word memory. And one of the things you can see up here is that I love this word plasticity, and it's always associated with the nervous system. I think you might remember me using plasticity with stem cells, you might remember that. But plasticity also has to do with the brain, because the brain is so modifiable, which is sweet. You know, you play that game, I think we've all played that game, in a group of friends where you say, hey, if there's 1 cent that I want to lose, or if I had to lose 1 cent, what would I lose? Or you might say, hey, when I go into an elevator and I see the buttons on the elevator and then I see that there's Braille right next to it, I'm sure we've all stroked it, you know, and say, hey, what does this mean? And we can't feel jack, right? It just feels like bumps, but we can't feel like there's 2 bumps to the right, 1 bump to the left. So what happens when someone loses one area of their brain is that it doesn't go dormant. It's plastic, it can change, it can modify, and it can help out other areas of the brain, which is really neat. And that's what explains the fact that blind people have unbelievable, super sensitive touch. Ah, that's pretty neat. So if you've ever seen somebody read Braille, they're not like you and I would be, like, I feel a bump. They're like this, wham, wham, wham. I mean, they're just stroking that piece of paper, and all of that information is just funneling into their brain. You know, that takes another aspect of your brain that you and I do not have. You know, and maybe we can train our brain to do that, but boy, when your brain has nothing to do, it's looking for something to do. It's looking to help some other part of the brain. Yeah.
Does their body adapt to that too? Do they make more like sensory neurons, or is it?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I just think that the part of the brain that's involved with sense of touch expands. Yeah, that region. Yeah, Jocelyn.
So we had a priest that was blind, and I was one of his servers, so I would hold the book for him while he was reading from it. But he was blind around like age 8, so he had the ability to see before. And I noticed as he was reading Braille, his eyes would also go like they were reading. I thought that was really cool.
So they were like following his hand.
Yeah, even
But
though he couldn't
unconscious.
see anything. Yeah.
Huh, that's neat. So let's get into the chemical explanation of forming a memory. Now that we know that there's different circuits, we can see again that it has a lot to do with this idea of changing a synapse, changing the postsynaptic neuron. We're going to be using terms like calcium here in a second. So when we look at the physical base of memory, we're going to be saying, is it a synapse that has been modified in any way? Is there some type of chemical alteration that's taken place? If there has been, then usually we associate that with a long-term memory. So let's get into immediate memory and talk about what that is versus long-term memory. This is being able to identify the here and now. People with late-stage Alzheimer's, they can tell you all about their past. They can tell you about 1926, exactly what happened to them. But they can't tell you what day it is. They can't tell you what year. They can't even tell you if they had breakfast that morning. So immediate memory is the one that usually shows the most serious forms of dementia, when you start lacking immediate memory. So it's being able to feel the flow of events. It's being able to identify what has happened just a few seconds ago, and it involves reverberating circuits. So that's good. So for most of us, we know we're at Cincinnati State, we know what day of the week it is. So we just take that for granted. Now, when we get into short-term memory, that's when you notice things that change as you get older. Ben has talked about it, David's talked about it, I talked about it. So with the aging process, it becomes more of a challenge. And I hope that you remember that it'll eventually happen to you. So don't give up, don't get frustrated, just learn about new ways to kind of beat the system. You always want to keep growing synapses. Remember that story about cage potatoes. So for some people, when they leave Kroger, they can't remember where they parked, or they are constantly losing their keys. My kids will say that is me. They'll say, my daughter, when she rides in the car with me, she'll say, Dad, do you have your wallet? Do you have your phone? You know, because I'll go like 3 miles and say, wallet, you know? It's like a continual thing. So I have to start reverberating my circuits. But how do we do that? Look, calcium must need to be present longer. It needs to accumulate. So if the calcium levels start to stay in the knob, that means more synapses will take place, more communication, because there's more neurotransmitter being released. So reverberating the circuit is constantly applying a action potential and opening up the calcium floodgates. It makes sense that if we're constantly giving an electrical shock to those voltage-gated channels. I hope that makes sense.
Well, if you have
Go ahead.
if you have a lack of calcium, then
Yeah, so calcium is, so if you're
do
calcium
you just take a
deprived-
supplement, or?
Well, it depends. You know, if you're talking about calcium for bone density, you need some other things like vitamin D. But in terms of extracellular calcium, supplements definitely do help.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, this is the biggest thing that I want you to circle, is that the second bullet point says that what makes a long-term memory long-term is that there's physical remodeling of the synapse. Look, it says there's new branching of what? Axons and dendrites. There's a molecular change. So this is the first time that we've ever said that an action potential lingers so much, whether it's procedural, muscle memory, or whether it's something that you have reverberated so many times, like what is 6 times 3, you know? It causes that pathway to be altered, so it's very easily accessible. There is a part of the brain that I want to talk about, because we would have talked about it on Tuesday, but we don't have a lecture on Tuesday. There's a part of the brain that I want you to write down called the amygdala. So the amygdala is a part of the brain that is responsible for organizing thoughts, ready? Thoughts that are associated with emotion. That's a good one. There's a structure that's very close to it called the hippocampus. And these two have a very good working relationship. The hippocampus is where the long-term memories are technically stored. It's where you can retrieve those specific altered synapses. It's a pathway. So the relationship between the amygdala and the hippocampus, researchers have found are really kind of interesting, and all of us would say, we already know that. If I would say, where was your first kiss? Whoa, that's emotion. When you got a phone call that said someone died, whoa, where were you? Oh, you remember right now. For me, and I'm old, I can remember when the Twin Towers were bombed in New York City. I can tell you exactly where I was. Look, I'm getting goosebumps right now. Where I was on 275 in Coleraine. Where I was, I had my kid in my backseat in a child seat, I can remember hearing it on 700 WLW. I can remember it to this day, you know? What allows emotional things like that, you know? Your first kiss, something tragic, something happy, or maybe music. I love this. You know, I'm really into music. I love all genres of music. When I go running, I listen to, I think I told you in the beginning of the semester, I listen to rap, I listen to country, I listen to Christian music, I listen to everything, everything. But when I hear a song, you know, like from the 70s or even 80s, I can think back, oh my gosh, 10th grade art class or whatever. You know? I can think about it exactly, you know? Something about music tells me that that was an emotional thing, and it's stored in my hippocampus. I love that.
Is the thing with like smells and stuff? Cause I'll get a whiff of
Smells!
something, like, oh my god.
Yes! That was my next thing I was gonna write. Yes, Mary.
Armpits.
So, should I just write armpits? Yeah, so all of these things influence the amygdala, which I love. I don't know if you've seen this. This was popular on YouTube and Facebook probably 5 years ago. There was a nursing home gentleman who had severe form of dementia to the point where they just parked him in the hallway every day and he didn't talk or look at anybody. And then they introduced the iPod to him and they played music, and his reaction was like he turned on. They played music of his generation, and all of a sudden he went from being mute, never talking, to singing loud, and they'd take the music off of him, listen, and they could ask him questions, and he would have a conversation, which was 100% impossible. This person was locked down, not talking at all. So music kind of turned him on again, and I love that.
But it was all like long-term though, wasn't it?
Oh, it wasn't long term, no. It was like, it was something that you could have a conversation, but then he faded. But the fact that, and then the family loved that because they could reconnect with their father, even if it was for 10 minutes at a time, they took it.
Right.
Because they thought he was done. You know, let's go visit Dad, but we don't know if he's listening or if he can communicate.
Do you think that music got him to a, sorry,
You're like, but
Go
do you
ahead.
think it got him to a threshold, and then while it was firing still, that's why
Yeah,
he could
something,
probably access
yeah, I
those
do
memories?
believe
And
that.
then as that slowly faded down, or maybe it was like a calcium thing where it's like getting more
Yeah,
efficient. and
I
fades out.
agree with that, Amanda. I think that's a very good explanation.
I have a resident like that, he doesn't talk at all, but if you put, he was a pilot, he had wrecked his plane, and had severe brain damage, and like you put a book of planes in front of him, he's got the plane, like I drove this plane, he knows all the names
Oh,
of
so
the
she
planes.
starts talking about
Naming
it.
the planes and stuff, he never talks unless you put a book of planes in front of him.
Really?
Crazy.
I love that, Mary.
Awesome.
Huh. Yeah, Nikki?
So, especially in children, but if somebody has a traumatic emotional experience, and then they
Yeah.
say they forget it completely, like they
Yeah.
can't even, they come up to it and then whatever's
Okay.
happening in their life, is this all part of that system too, or?
Well, you could talk about PTSD, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I had a student, she withdrew from my Xavier class, I guess I can technically talk about this. But she had, maybe I even talked about this before with you guys, she had a psychiatric event in my class, and the police were called. I mean, it was scary. I mean, it was like scary for me. They took her away in handcuffs, it was that scary. And she withdrew, and I found out later she experienced, the reason why she had these psychiatric issues was that she had some event that happened to her in the past, and of course I didn't want to know. But it can come back and it can cause weird things, you know, and we talk about the people in the military having that kind of effects as well. So, you know, for the amygdala, the emotions can be happy emotions. It can be a smell of like, hey, if I had pumpkin spice being pumped in right here, everybody would say, oh my gosh, it's Halloween, it's getting close to Thanksgiving, you know? But then if I had the smell of like a dead body, or for me, if I had the smell of like a dead cat, because that's what I work on, you know, that's my career. You know, when I'm retired, if I smell formaldehyde, I'm gonna say, oh my gosh, dead cats. You know? That was my life. Justin.
So is that why, I know some of the early signs of dementia and Alzheimer's are like angry outbursts for no reason. Is that why?
I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I know that Alzheimer patients can get very angry,
Yeah.
very violent, but I don't know.
They want to know their.
Yeah, I think it's like frustration. Yeah,
And
David.
My grandfather had Alzheimer's, and his reactions were different. He didn't get angry, but he did get panicky. But he always did, he smoked too, he smoked until the day he died. He always had a note in his pocket that says, "You have Alzheimer's." So it would always calm him down. Because it would like, I guess it would re-trigger
Oh,
certain memories. It was pretty bad. In fact, he actually mistook me for my dad. Complained to me about not giving my mom a fourth grandchild. That was really weird.
There was some research that was kind of cool that was done with a university in Boston, I can't remember which one, but they took these students who were studying something incredibly tough, in engineering or something. And after the really challenging lecture, they had tubs of ice by the door. And they, on the way out, they were asked to submerge their arms in ice. And it was supposed to trigger kind of like that first kiss response. Like if you had some type of horrible emotional or cold response, it may help you remember like what happened during that day.
Like being in this room.
Yeah, so there was research that said that if you like went from learning something really intense and like took an ice cold shower, I mean, this is research that it could potentially be effective.
So if you forget something for a test, just throw the bucket of ice.
Exactly. You're just gonna line up after class and smack the crap out of everybody who wants to forget everything?
who wants a free snack?
Hey, but yeah.
Slide up in front of a man.
My slap wouldn't be devastating.
All right, so let's move on. I want to talk about a situation where an older man had some type of illness that affected his hippocampus. So he was unable to learn anything new, but all of his old memories were intact, and he didn't have Alzheimer's. And it was an interesting research study, and boy, this guy's just a sweet old grandpa, but I want you to watch kind of the research that they used with him. You may have seen
I can remember what happened down there 55 years ago, as if it were yesterday. But I've already forgotten the name of somebody I met just yesterday.
I'm sorry, I forget her name. What's her name?
To explore how we remember, we visit a man who can't.
I don't remember.
Then we peer into the brain of a man with plump hippocampi. Wow, you won't even care what it means.
Well, in this case, bigger is better.
We discover how ice can make memories stronger.
Okay?
What?
Contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
When I was 12, I went swimming alone in the surf down there. It was rougher than it is today. I was a strong swimmer. For a while, it was fun letting the waves pull me out to sea and tumble me over and over again under the surface. But when I tried to get out, I couldn't. And I started to panic. I realized I might drown. Eventually, I was able to claw my way up the beach, grabbing at handfuls of sand. That was 55 years ago, and I still remember it vividly. I remember the waves pummeling me, taking me under, wet sand under my feet. The roar of the waves. I remember the sting of the salt spray. So where and what is memory? How is it tucked away in my brain, ready to come back in an instant? Tucked away along with, but separate from, hundreds of thousands of, maybe millions of other memories. Where's the smell of the salt spray, the grittiness of the sand, the crashing of the rocks? In the next hour, we're going to find out how we create our memories Not just vivid ones like this, but where I left my car keys, the name of that familiar-looking person across the room there. And we'll be looking at how memories are lost, how as we grow older, they become slippery, elusive, sometimes vanishing forever, erasing our past and who we are. We're starting our exploration of memory a few miles up the coast from La Jolla, with a man whose own ability to create memories vanished almost entirely a decade ago. Ever since, he's been helping researchers from the University of California, San Diego. Today, Larry Squire and Jen Frascino are on the latest of many visits the team has made to the man known to memory researchers everywhere as EP.
Oh, that's wonderful. Got a nice son for the camera.
Yeah. We're gonna go in, we're gonna do some work with him.
EP is now 82.
This is fun. Go ahead.
In 1992, retired from a career in electronics, he suffered an acute virus infection that destroyed part of his brain.
Research and development, that's what I like.
Most of his thinking skills survived the damage virtually intact.
Why should people pay taxes?
To support their country and their counties and states to pay for things.
If you were lost in the forest during the day, how would you go about finding your way out?
I would find a river and follow the river down to wherever it may go. Ocean, lake.
EP can also copy complex drawings.
That is, huh?
And he not only has no difficulty repeating back a list of words, in this case, dog, raccoon, lion, and parrot.
Dog, raccoon, lion, and a parrot.
Good.
But he even has a little sly fun with Jen along the way.
What you gotta add is about 2 more.
Oh, really? Would that make it tougher?
And that would catch them. You know, leaf. Medicine.
EP really hits his stride when the testing of his cognitive skills involves Jen's laptop computer.
Gold. Having been in electronics over the years, I am amazed at all this. It's just wonderful. Believe me, little printed circuits, just, oh, you can't believe it. It used to be in a 6-foot rack, and down to this, it's just wonderful. When I was in electronics, it used to be in a 6-foot rack.
But it's now that something odd about EP's behavior becomes apparent.
Printed circuits, diodes, triodes, and all that stuff in there. Oh, it's just amazing, believe me. When I was in electronics, this would be in a 6-foot rack. This would be in a 6-foot rack. It would be in a couple 6-foot racks. It would be in a 6-foot rack. This would be in a 6-foot rack. And now look at it, down to this. Little printed circuits and...
So he's not aware that he's told us 3 or 4 times that he used to be in electronics, that a computer used to fill a room, and that now it's down to the size of a microchip. He's just not aware that he said those things several times.
No, he tells us the same stories again and again. We've heard these stories before, and we'll hear these stories again.
The equipment that it takes.
How was it? How have you been enjoying this?
I enjoyed this.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Look at the work you guys are doing. You're getting wonderful, I believe.
I'm sorry, I forget her name. What's her name?
Her name?
Yeah.
I don't remember.
Okay, Jennifer.
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 Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Have you met Jennifer before today?
Listen.
I think so, yes. I'm not positive though.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my.
No.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
We all have.
Well, we all just have.
Oh, sure. How much have you worked with him?
We have probably visited his house 200 times.
200 times. And for him, is each time the first time for him?
Well, you see, it's yes and no. It's clear that he does have a record of the experiences that are based on the habits, the interactions, the emotional values of the interactions, the fact that they've been positive and not negative. He certainly lets us in the door faster.
I mean, like you saw, he couldn't tell you my name.
Yeah.
He couldn't tell you if he saw me before. But there's definitely a rapport there that I think has been built, and he's aware on some level. I read you some words about 15 minutes ago.
Remember them? You remember them?
4 of them. 4 words. Do you remember me reading you 4 words?
No, I can't
No?
recall, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Don't need to
My
apologize.
mind is getting old.
That's okay. I read you 4 animals, and I want you to tell me yes if you think the animal was on the list I read you about 15 minutes ago, or no if it was not on the list.
Wonderful.
Okay? Cat.
Cat,
Yes,
yes.
How sure are you?
I feel reasonably sure on that cat.
Raccoon.
Raccoon,
No,
no.
no, I feel no.
Giraffe.
Yes,
Yeah.
How sure are you that I
I'm real sure on that.
Real sure?
They're beautiful animals.
Okay. Lion.
Lion,
No.
no.
Okay.
EP's inability to remember things that happened just a few minutes ago can be traced directly to the damage the virus inflicted on his brain a decade ago. The areas destroyed were in his temporal lobes, most critically a structure called the hippocampus and the brain tissue immediately around it. Without a hippocampus, EP lives in a permanent present. Anything new that happens to him simply doesn't get recorded.
Do you remember drawing something for me today?
No.
Drawing something about
No.
15, 20 minutes ago?
No.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Then don't apologize.
Yeah.
Thank you for trying. Thank you.
But although EP can't record new memories, old ones from the years before his hippocampus was destroyed are remarkably intact. He grew up in Hayward, California.
How about your house on Castro Valley Boulevard to the Hayward Theater? Remember where the Hayward Theater is?
Yes, I would leave the house and turn to the right to A Street, down A Street to Castro Boulevard, and turn to the left, and it's in the middle of the block. Hayward,
Okay, and if you didn't go down to A Street, if you instead took, you could take another street. What would you
the
do?
center, Redwood Road.
Uh-huh, okay.
Redwood Road would run right into it.
How about the public library, Hayward Public Library,
Uh,
from your house?
Be the same thing going down A Street, and A, you have to go to the left to B, and it's on the corner.
You can remember.
I don't
He's got that map in his head. He can see all these streets.
Used to ride his bicycle around.
Last thing I wanna talk to you about is the neighborhood that we're in now.
Watch.
Here.
How about any of the streets around here? Can you tell me any of the street names in the neighborhood here?
Look at it.
No, I cannot.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, you don't need to apologize.
Oh, I know where Castro Valley Boulevard, but that's where I was born and raised. But right here, I have to say no, I'm sorry. No, I just live right here. Okay.
Enjoy the world.
So I
rather than-
enjoy our area right here.
What a great attitude. Look at it.
You seem to enjoy your life.
Oh, I
The enthusiastic help of amnesics like EP has pinpointed the hippocampus as crucial for recording new memories.
places that was just wonderful.
At the same time, the fact that EP has vivid memories from years before his hippocampus was destroyed means the hippocampus can't be where they're permanently stored.
We love it here.
It's to probe more deeply into how memories are formed that we're meeting another amnesic. But this time, it's a man whose hippocampus, although badly damaged as a result of a heart attack 5 years ago, still struggles to put memories together.
So what I'd like to do is just show you some pictures and ask you, what can you tell me about these pictures? Do they evoke any memory? What does it bring back for you?
Chuck's memory is being studied by Dr. Mika Ferfeli.
Here, this is something that you might have seen in any of the local newspapers in the last year.
But it certainly has something to do with people objecting to.
We're in Boston, where the recent sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church have received intense media coverage.
People who are somehow hurting, abusing, not paying enough attention to others.
Good. Is that a picture that looks familiar to you?
I believe this is a picture taken the day or days after the towers in New York were all.
Chuck, do you remember where you were when that happened?
Not at all. I remember at the time being especially worried because my son was in New York, And obviously the first thing I
As Chuck's wife remembers very well, this isn't so. Their son lives in New York today, but he didn't on 9/11. Chuck taught English before his illness, and he's continued to write since, giving us a unique glimpse into a mind that knows only too acutely what it has lost.
Listen to this.
I cannot remember my wedding day or the celebration surrounding it. I do not recall the birth of my sons, my father's death, or who most other family members are.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine that? So when you think of the hippocampus and the memory component, we now know that there's issues associated with things other than related with age. Heart attacks, depriving oxygen to certain parts of the brain can also have huge effects. Well, I want to end with something that, like David has some experience with. My grandfather had Alzheimer's disease, and I'm, of course, I'm not expecting you to write any of this down or whatever, but I want to talk a little bit about what this is. This is now, this is the second most feared illness in the United States, behind cancer. People who have Alzheimer's are people that have this gradual memory loss that affects the entire family. It's not just your spouse. I mean, it has a huge effect on everyone. But it's a gradual thing, and one of the interesting things about Alzheimer's is that we know what causes it. We just can't figure out how to fix it. And what you can see is that when you look at the cause, and let's write this down, that there are these things called tangles and plaques. And when you hear the words tangles and plaques, it's made up of a specialized protein called amyloid beta. Amyloid beta can form in between neurons and within neurons. And we know that this amyloid beta is the protein that is kind of the symptomatic substance that is associated with Alzheimer's. And people who have Alzheimer's usually are older people, but then you hear of this rare condition where it's called early onset Alzheimer's. And that's when it's really sad, when you start seeing signs of it in your 30s. Can you imagine that? So I've always said, and I'll say this again, and maybe you heard me say this, is that when I teach, 18-year-old females from Indianapolis and Cleveland, which is the majority of my students at Xavier, I would say 80% of them on the first day say they want to work in Children's Hospital, and they want to work in delivery and OB or whatever. But then I tell them, I said, at some point, someone's going to have to take care of your parents, or someone has to take care of your grandparents. So working with the elderly, I think, requires a special calling. That's what you want to call it. I call them angels. But then if you say, I want to work in an area where there's Alzheimer's and dementia, that takes a really special person. About 2 summers ago, in this very class, my night class, I had some female students who worked at the Alois Alzheimer's place. And they told me that, they were looking forward to getting out. They spent 2 or 3 years there, but every night it was like potential battle with their patients. Like, it's time for your bath. And then some of them would say, what are you doing taking off my clothes? I've never seen you before. And yet that person's been there every night, for 3 years. And so it can get violent, and they would all tell me that, they've all been punched, And just think about that. That person's not doing it because they're violent. They have pride, They see this person coming in and doing things to them, It's really, really sad. My experience with my grandfather, my last experience was probably 7th or 8th grade. My mom took me in, and I can remember my grandfather being very happy to see me. He was telling me stories. He was a farmer in Connersville, Indiana. He was telling me stories about being a farmer that I had heard before, but then I quickly picked up that he had no idea who I was. He was happy to have a visitor, he was happy to tell stories, but he had no idea. And I can remember leaving and telling my mom, I said, I don't think Grandpa knew who I was. And my mom never took me back, because he progressively got worse, and I don't think she wanted me to see that. You know, so it was a big deal. And so when we think of Alzheimer's and we think of other forms of dementia, we can even throw in Parkinson's kind of in the group of dementia. And we said that Parkinson's was uncontrolled muscular movement, but it is a mental component as well, and it has an effect on memory. So, Alzheimer's, I just wanted to mention that, and when we talk about memory and the hippocampus, I want you to know something about tangles and plaques, because I think some of you will pursue this, and that's the cutting edge research, is trying to figure out how to get rid of that amyloid beta. All right, so we'll end it today, and if you have lab, we'll start at 7. Now I'll see you on